This week on the Wake and Bake podcast,
Cannabis and sex is one of the hottest topics that we talk about as cannabis educators.
what is going on over there?
They were regaining relationships with their partners, feeling like more powerful, more sexy, more like, I got that. Just walking around with that energy.
It's kind of like a grumpy grump about it. I was like, ugh, I guess we'll see if there's any data now.
Then you started blowing up my phone with screenshots about data about weed lube. So you found some.
And she was like, my stopwatch is in my hoo-ha.
That's where I keep it. So yeah, weed lube changing the world.
I'm worried about a 9-minute orgasm. Like, would it be rude if I was like, hang on 1 second, I need to...
What are you talking about? I think those are going to be amazing. I've had a several-minute orgasm and you do not feel like doing anything else. So to have a 9-minute one, like, bring it on. Maybe we can try for 10.
So, Andrea, I think we need to be true to ourselves for this episode and start this podcast out really nerdy so that people know what they're getting into when we talk about cannabis and sex. You agree?
I totally agree. Let's go.
Okay, good. I'm glad. So you're a nerd. I presume that you know who Carl Sagan is.
I love Carl Sagan.
You love Carl Sagan. When you think about Carl Sagan, what do you think about?
Cosmos, the TV show.
Really? I always think about turtlenecks. When I was like writing my list, I'm like, how would you describe Carl Sagan? I was like, turtlenecks was the first word that came up. I was like, turtlenecks, astronomer, coolest nerd on the planet. That was my description of Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan is a little lesser known for his love for cannabis. I think people who love cannabis know that Carl Sagan loved cannabis. But I don't think most people understand how much Carl Sagan loved cannabis. He wrote rather extensively about cannabis. And in one essay back in 1971, he even mentioned that cannabis, quote, enhances the enjoyment of sex and, quote, gives an exquisite sensitivity. Because he's the coolest nerd. So he says stuff like that. And he writes about weed in such a way. Isn't that wonderful?
That is wonderful. Exquisite sensitivity. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. You could say that Carl Sagan thought that cannabis and sex was out of this world. Oh,
well played. Well played, CT.
There's going to be a lot of those in this episode.
All joking aside, cannabis and sex is one of the hottest topics that we talk about as cannabis educators. Whenever I've done a workshop on cannabis and sex, I get like double the attendance at least. And at one point I had like 65 women in a room together talking about this. So yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, we know it too. And we've done like lives and Q&As about cannabis and sex every year. More people tune in. I'm interested to see if it does the same thing on the podcast. But I'm wondering, like, when I was putting this together, like, why is that? Why is it that so many people, like, when we say cannabis and sex together, they're like, what? Is it because, like, that old notion of, like, sex sells, people want to know more about it, they want to know how to have better sex all the time? Or is it because people want to know why it is that they've had an experience maybe where smoking a little bit of cannabis changed their sexual experience and they just want to know what's behind that and if they can have a little more control over it? Or I'm curious if it's just the combination being so taboo, right? The cannabis is taboo and sex is taboo. People are like looking at it like, you know, like a sideshow, like what is going on over there? But when you got 65 women together, what was it like? Were they all just like enthusiastic, like wanting to know how to use it better? Or were they like, I just want to see what this lead is going to say?
No, they were enthusiastically wanting to learn to use it to have better sex. Yeah.
Yeah. And that makes a whole lot of sense. And if you are here listening to this podcast, we have a lot of new information and new data and new ways to think about cannabis and sex that even we hadn't really explored before. So I'm really excited to dive in and share the science behind cannabis and sexual health. We'll also be giving you a couple of incredible weed lube recipes that you can try after we share how incredible that particular tool is for cannabis and sex. So make sure that you stay tuned all the way until the end to get the lowdown on a recipe that could give you a 9-minute orgasm, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Andrea, what do you think about a 9-minute orgasm?
What are you talking about? I think those are going to be amazing. We said before, I've had a several-minute orgasm and you do not feel like doing anything else when you're in those orgasms. So to have a 9-minute one, like bring it on. Maybe we can try for 10. Like, let's get to 10.
Let's go further. Let's
Yeah.
this 9-minute orgasm. The reason I say the 9-minute orgasm is if you Google weed lube, there are lots of accounts of these super long orgasms. I ran into one today. And when I was thinking about it, I was like, I don't time my orgasms ever. I've never like with a stopwatch, like started now,
Go.
ended now. I was like, what would I do in a 9-minute orgasm? Like I don't think I can go that long without checking my email. So I'm worried about a 9-minute orgasm. Like, would it be rude if I was like, hang on one second, I need to
I'm
make
telling
sure.
you, I do not think you're going to want the extra hit of dopamine. You're going to be just fine with the amount of dopamine that's currently flowing.
You have to update this podcast to see if that's true.
It's true. But first, we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. The Wake and Bake podcast is brought to you by the Cannabis Coaching Institute. The Cannabis Coaching Institute's certified cannabis educator program is now globally accredited by the International Practitioners of Holistic Medicine. In as little as 12 weeks, you can be out there certified, putting on workshops, talks, retreats, or doing creative work like putting out podcasts and writing books, all centered around helping others with this powerful plant. Andrea is the lead cannabis science educator, and I'm the program director, and I teach business for cannabis educators and coaches. And at CCI, we've trained over 600 educators and coaches since 2018. It has been incredible to see how many people they've helped and what they've created in this world. So if you have a health and wellness business, or if you're feeling called to work with this plant in some way or enter the cannabis industry, go to cannabiscoachinginstitute.com to learn more.
Okay, so I am so excited for this because when you deep dive on subjects, you go like really in. So I know that I'm going to learn everything there is about cannabis and sex. So tell me, like, what do we know? What does the science show us?
Yeah, I did go pretty far into this topic. And I want to start off by pointing out that in this episode, we're not just talking about smoking cannabis and then having sex. I know it's what most people imagine when they think about combining these two things, but there is so much more to it than that. And then when we talk about sexual health, we're not just talking about the act of having sex with a partner. Again, it's what most people think about when you say the word sex. We're talking about the whole kit and caboodle. And what's cool is that historically, for millennia, before some jerkwads made it against the law, this plant has been used to help with things like menstrual issues, low libido, menopause, childbirth, pelvic pain, right? All these different quote unquote issues or aspects of sexual health. And for thousands of years, humans didn't do that only by smoking high THC cannabis, right? Which is the most dominant way that humans use cannabis today. It's the number one category in dispensaries is smokable flower. And when we look back before prohibition, historically, that wasn't the most popular ingestion method for cannabis. People from the past would never have seen cannabis as strong as it is today. And by strong, I mean having as much THC in it as it does today. So, for example, one joint today could be the THC equivalent of 20 joints back in the 70s. So, when we're talking about even smoking cannabis later on in the podcast, I just wanted to point out that less is certainly more in 2024, right? When we're talking about THC and sex. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm curious to see why that is.
You're curious to see why weed's so strong now? Why it's
No, I'm
crazy?
curious why like you're starting with telling us that less is more, particularly with sex. And this is intriguing to me.
Yeah, well, I want us to have more of a historical perspective on it, because if we're going to talk about all of these ways that cannabis has been used to promote sexual health throughout the ages, then I think we just have to acknowledge that the cannabis that we see and that we consume today and the way that we consume it is very different,
Yeah,
right? We're going to talk about smoking cannabis, but that's just not what people typically would have been doing. I mean, think about it, Andrea. Before cannabis went underground and people started breeding it to have higher and higher THC concentrations, it had fewer terpenes, it had fewer cannabinoids. Like, it just wasn't as strong in general as it is today. And so again, I think that this is just a good opportunity for me to point that out. I always love pointing out that thing about like the joints being 20 times the joint that your mom smoked, like it's much stronger. And so it has different effects. And so I think I wanted to address that too, because if people are listening to this podcast saying, well, sometimes maybe, or I had a bad experience and it backfired and I felt anxious and paranoid and weird in my body. Well, that might be because the approach of using the super strong cannabis of today might not be a good fit.
That's a really good point. I think even too, when we think about like oftentimes when men think about cannabis and sex, they're worried about performance issues because
Mm,
oftentimes maybe they're using too much and they're putting themselves in too much of a relaxed state. So yeah, I think it's
mhm.
important to talk about that.
Yeah, we'll address that in more detail a little bit later on. I just wanted to again just circle back around to it to remind people that throughout history, people use lower THC, probably higher CBD cannabis in teas, oils, topicals, foods, and they used all parts of the plant, not just the resinous buds that you're going to be getting from dispensaries. Right? They also smoked it. Yes, they did. There's obviously so much historical context for smoking cannabis, but that wasn't the only way. And I would say it wasn't the dominant way when we look back through time. Would you
Yeah,
agree?
Queen Victoria is always everybody always talks about how Queen Victoria, had a doctor who prescribed cannabis for her menstrual cramps, and yeah, it was tinctures, like, she wasn't smoking a doobie in the bathroom, you know?
That's how I do wanna picture her doing that, like, in her
Yeah, me too.
fancy bathroom with her, like, wild tall hair. "Oh, my wig smells like weed now." No, it was discreet. It was and we've talked about this before when Tammy Sweet said that, like, inhalation is not necessarily the way for everyone. Again, I just wanna point that out. I wanna give as many invitations to people as possible to rethink, okay, what is cannabis when it comes to sex? Because when we start looking at sexual health and cannabis both in a more holistic way, I think we can see even more opportunities to improve sex with cannabis outside of what we already know and what the science says.
Okay, but let's start with, like, smoking and sex, because again, I think that's what most people think about when they're talking about this. Is there actual data to back up what's happening there?
Yeah, I think many of us have had an anecdotal Carl Sagan experience, which is what I'm going to call the cannabis and smoking cannabis and having sex from now on. Like, let's go have a Carl Sagan experience. And right, you realize like, oh, I've smoked some cannabis, I'm with a partner or I'm by myself and I'm super turned on and the sexual experience I have is enhanced. Like, what's going on here? And it's true that many sensory experiences benefit from the fast onset increased awareness that inhaling high THC cannabis brings. Right? You can see this in eating food. How much better is food after you've smoked a little weed? How much better is music, yoga, meditation? These sensory experiences get heightened because the awareness gets heightened and it happens really quickly. And so I think many people have had that experience, again, anecdotally, where they just kind of happen to combine those two things and they're like, wow, this is much, much better. And if things feel better, we're likely to do them more, right? So it's not that much of a surprise to note that cannabis users scientifically have more sex. Actually, cannabis users have about 20% more sex than normies and reportedly enjoy the sex that they're having more. So we're having more sex and we like it more. So already there's data in our corner, right?
Go us.
Okay, did you say go us?
I'm so proud of cannabis users right now.
I know we're getting
We're
after
getting
it.
some.
We're getting some. Yeah, in one survey-based study, over 70% of participants reported increased desire and orgasm intensity. So 70% having better orgasms and wanting to have sex more. In that same study, people who reported masturbating indicated that cannabis enhanced their pleasure while masturbating as well. That's 62% enjoyed their solo experience more with cannabis. And in another survey study, 74% reported increased sensitivity to touch, right? So there's a lot saying here that smoking cannabis makes things better, makes you have more desire, it makes the touch better, right? So we have some survey data that says so. So there's clearly a physical component that links up the use of smoking cannabis to having more and better sex. The flip side is also true. And I think this is one of the reasons why people tune in to this conversation so much is because not just because they've had a good experience with cannabis and sex, but typically because they've had one that they wouldn't like to have again, right? And smoking too much THC can cause too much physical relaxation, right? You get couch lock, which isn't good for the sexual experience. It could potentially make you feel anxious. You could be unable to focus, or you could just feel weird in your body. Have you ever felt weird in your body when you use too much THC?
I haven't felt weird in my body, but I have felt weird in my mind. Like I have had
Yeah.
where cannabis kind of like messes with my mind in that space. Can we talk more about that, about the mental aspect and what's going on there?
Yeah, so much of the sexual experience takes place in set and setting, right? In the area that you're in, the environment that you're in, and in your mental headspace. I was kind of blown away by how much psychology plays a role in the sexual experience. And as I was researching this, I wasn't just looking at cannabis. I was just curious about how much our mindset and our psychology really is a factor in whether or not we have good sexual experiences. And a meta analysis found that there was a 95% improvement in over 20 clinical trials that used psychological intervention for sexual dysfunction. So many things were positively impacted by addressing the psychology and not just the physical aspect of sexuality. And the things in that particular study that were most help were these clinical names that that doctors use for things like low libido, like a chronically low libido, and inability to orgasm for women. So to have an improvement in so many of those cases for those particular things by just impacting the psychology, that was like
Mhm.
a huge thing for me, right? And it's not just for women. The other thing that completely blew my mind is that, for example, 40% of cases of erectile dysfunction are considered psychogenic. And the factors that they talk about when they're uncovering what might be going on when it comes to ED for dudes is anxiety, depression, guilt, low self-esteem, relationship concerns. So these pretty common psychological factors really play a role in what a lot of Western medicine and a lot of us in the West consider a physical issue.
Mhm. And so when you're saying some of these things, it feels like cannabis should be able to help with lots of these mental issues. Is this a case of like cannabis to the rescue?
I know we're like this, right? I know we're like the in my big fat Greek wedding, the Windex lady. We're like that with like, well, if CBD doesn't work, then THC, then CBDA. But right? I mean, yeah, when you look at that list, how many of those things do we say over and over again that cannabis can help with? But not usually with high amounts of THC, especially inhaled. That's not necessarily the way to work with those particular issues, especially with things like anxiety. It's so easy to tip over, especially in a sexual experience if you're already having those issues. I don't think that's necessarily the answer for a lot of people who are coming to this topic with I've got something going on, not I'm just trying to enhance it. I'm not trying, just trying to make
Right.
it feel better, but like I have pain or anxiety or something that else that's going on. Again, it's one of those things that I'm smoking high THC cannabis is probably not going to be your best friend in those situations.
Yeah.
That being said, in one of the studies that I mentioned earlier, 69.8% of respondents said they could relax more during sex, and 50.5% said they were better able to focus. So again, you kind of have a 50-50 shot. Maybe you smoke cannabis and it's great. Maybe you have a harder time focusing, right? And that's I don't like those odds personally, and so that's why I want to talk about some of these other things that you can do if you aren't one of those people who's like, I smoked a little bit of cannabis. I can focus. My anxiety is gone. I'm totally relaxed. If that's not you, that's normal and that's okay. But I want to point out that in these particular kinds of experiences, um, sexual intimacy, yoga, meditation, the things where you're not really distracted by the outside world, you really want to take it easy and start low and go slow, right? It's more important in these particular types of activities to take it easy because it is so easy to overdo it. And if you overdo it, you may not want to do it. And that's why I paid the big bucks for the comedy school. Thank you so much for laughing at my joke, Andrea. It's not like that was written into the script or anything. So I really appreciate that very organic, authentic laugh. Now, I'm not sure if this is a physical or a psychological component. I'm not sure which one this falls under, but in that same survey of the 28 participants who reported difficulty reaching orgasm, 14, so half, said it was easier to reach orgasm while using cannabis. So again, if you're having a hard time reaching those states, it's not all about having this 9-minute orgasm, right? Sometimes you're just moving a little bit closer from A to B, like having a more pleasant sexual experience or having your first orgasm or being able to have sex without pain or
Mhm.
anxiety, like those are huge wins. And so sometimes this conversation around cannabis and sex, it's so glamorized and they throw these big 9-minute long orgasms and all this stuff at you. But in reality, like the idea that cannabis could help even a little bit, like move that needle in the right direction, that's what I would love for people to get after leaving this podcast is like, oh, well, I could use cannabis and see if it's a little bit better. Not like reaching for these like ecstatic states of, bliss and trying not to check your email during your 9-minute orgasm.
And to know that there's multiple different ways to incorporate cannabis into your sex life. It's not just smoking. We're going to talk about other things soon.
Now,
It's a
before we
good
get
one.
to my favorite part of the cannabis and sex topic, I want to take a quick break and let listeners know that we are currently hosting a free webinar for people who are interested in doing this kind of work in the world. So if you want to say, I don't know, start a cannabis podcast with your best friend and a person that you love and respect, like Andrea Meharg, or if you're a healthcare or wellness professional, or if you're just plain passionate about this plant and want to help others with it, make sure to check out the free webinar, 3 Steps to Launching Your Successful Cannabis Wellness Business. In the webinar, Andrea and I will show you how to help others end the stigma and grow your business by putting on workshops and retreats, writing blogs and articles, and creating podcasts like this one, and more. In the webinar, we're going to share with you what we've learned in our combined 16 years. I actually think it's more than that. I think I messed up the math. I think we've got 18 years of shared experience as professional cannabis educators now, which is like a graduated child.
That's
Like
a
we've
whole
created
adult right there.
we had a whole adult worth of experience.
Yeah.
And I will share what I did to create a 6-figure business from scratch, just talking about this plant. Trust me, we need more voices out there having these conversations so more people know that cannabis is healthy and they know how it can help. So make sure you tune in after the episode.
Okay,
Mhm.
so what is your favorite part about talking about sex and cannabis then?
My favorite part of talking about cannabis and sex is talking about weed lube. Right? Weed lube, suppositories. I really like talking about the topical aspect of this because while cannabis and while inhaled high CBD cannabis and those things can be wonderful and they're cute, there's something so incredible about weed lube and nobody knows. Like, I swear nobody knows. Like, I'm walking around, I have my little flyers. I don't have them right now for a workshop that I'm doing next weekend. And it's got this little picture of weed lube on it. It says, make me. And people are like, what is that? And I'm like, it's weed lube and it does this and this. And people are like, well, my goodness, like that must sell out. And I'm like, you can't find it anywhere. No one has it. You have to make it yourself. So I think that one thing that I really want to see more of in the world is access to weed lube. And I want more people to try it. You want to talk about it?
Yeah, I want to talk about it. I also think it's so lovely that you're like trying these weed lube recipes on yourself, on your hand right now, so that so that we know what's going on out there. We can make our own. That's great.
Yeah, yeah. This whole rabbit hole has been a long, winding one. I can't wait to share that piece of like the new weed lube that is currently being developed and tested, like Andrea said, on my hands. One hand feels like lizard skin, and the other one is so soft and smooth after this weed lube test. Very excited. And before now, we have never had data on weed lube. This drove me nuts. Like, and we still don't really have good data on weed lube. Nobody's testing it. And as I started prepping for this workshop, I was like, okay, well, I'll just see. But I was kind of like a grumpy grump about it. I was like, ugh, I guess we'll see if there's any data now. And, there wasn't. And then I was like reading little articles here and there. And then, I mean, you know what happened. What happened next?
Then you started blowing up my phone with screenshots about data about weed lube. So you found some.
I found some. I was so excited. I couldn't stop. We're in a different time zone. So Andrew's like asleep and I stumble onto a couple of pieces of data and I'm like, oh my God, look at it. This is the best thing that's ever
Orgasm,
happened. And
orgasm.
yeah, the first thing I found was from who I would like to call a citizen scientist. She was using a smart vibrator, which I'd never heard of before. Did you know what a smart vibrator was before I
No,
sent that to you?
no idea.
No. No, I
That's
was
how she
like,
knew she had a 9-minute orgasm because who times these things?
who times it? Your vibrator's supposed to. It's 2024.
I didn't
It's
know.
supposed to like I wonder if there's like an AI patch like that you put into and like it starts to know you better than you know yourself. And then human men are obsolete.
Sorry, guys.
Sorry. So she was using this smart vibrator to measure the impact that weed lube had on her orgasm. So there's this really cool set of charts and these little graphs that she shared with and without weed lube. Absolutely, completely blew my mind. And so I have it linked below. Make sure you go check it out. It's really cool to just read about her experience and to be able to see this. Like, there's something about the visualization of it. And in the first chart, it's like it maxes out at like 20. I don't know what the 20 actually stands for, but it maxes out at 20. And she has this little thing that says, like, this is my orgasm. It was like this little tiny piece of the experience, you know? And then in the second one with weed lube, that 20 was like down here and the peak of the orgasm was like 60 and it just went on forever. And she's like, and that's weed lube. So that was crazy. And I was like, okay, well, at least we have like one little bit of data. And that's really cool to be able to visualize it and share that with people. But then I was looking up something on Foria's website, and Foria used to sell THC weed lube. They don't anymore. They only have CBD lube online. They've discontinued all of their THC stuff. And I was on their site and I found a survey they did that said over 91% of women who use their CBD lube had orgasms. And I was like, that seems high. How many women are typically having orgasms? And I Googled it and it was like 50%. And I was like, that's significantly higher. Now, granted, these are people who went out and bought a lube that was specifically to enhance, like the type of person that would buy that is more likely to, I think more probably more likely to already have better sexual experiences or like want a better sexual experience. And so like there could be placebo and all sorts of stuff in there. So take it with a grain of salt. But when I saw it, I was like, oh, cool. Other people are having good experiences with these products as well. And I'm guessing you can go on and look at regular lubes and stuff. They're not going to be like 91% orgasms if you tested them. You know what I mean? Like there is definitely something going on there to increase that so drastically. Do you think?
I agree. I'm surprised it was so high. Like in my head, I'm spinning. Is it pain relief? Like what's going on there?
The biggest problem with cannabis infused lube, especially with THC in it, is it's just hard to find, right? You can buy some of these CBD lubes online. They are very expensive. It's a big investment for people to take if they don't know if it's going to work for them. And so I think that is one of those things that makes it difficult for people to have this experience is like, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't want to throw down $60 on a teeny
Mhm.
tiny bottle, or I can't find it at a dispensary near me.
And people are nervous about making it on their own. This is different than making an oil that you're going to put into granola or your eggs or something, right? Like you're putting it in a sensitive area. So like we do have to
Mhm.
take care about like what this process is like for sure. You've made this several times before.
Yeah, and I made a human child testing weed lube. So the first time I ever tested weed lube. And so I want to say a couple of things about why it's worth it. I want to empower you. Like, yes, you want to take more care, and that we have different options that we'll talk about in a minute. But I want more people out there making their own weed lube. It's so cost effective. It's so worthwhile. And what's interesting is like, it's one of those things. Do you remember when we had the entire class of students at CCI that like 50% of them came in? They're like, I found the weed lube recipe and it changed my life. And then I gave it to a bunch of other people and it was changing their lives. And I was like, I need to study cannabis now. And so, like, to me, there is this element of it being like weed lube is the true gateway drug to cannabis nerddom. So I want people to feel confident that you can make this. There are different formulations. I want people to be out there making it because it feels incredible. Before I started using cannabis lube, I had sexual pain and sexual dysfunction for years, like on and off. I could never really figure out what was going on. Now looking back, I can see that there were just a lot of things that were out of balance. But at the time, when I used it for the first time, I was like, "Oh my gosh." It wasn't about an orgasm at all for me. It was about having sex without pain with my partner. And I was like, wow, this is life changing. And then over the years to hear that from so many people, right? Publishing that recipe, and I put it out on the internet in 2015, right? Because that was when Alice was born. And, I just thought it was fun. I was like, this is a fun thing. I can't wait to share it with the world. I was very shy talking about my own sexual experiences. And I felt really strange talking about like having sexual pain and pelvic floor dysfunction and those kinds of things. And then to hear all the people and get emails and messages still to this day from people who are like, this one recipe changed my relationship with my body, changed my
Mhm.
relationship with my partner, gave me like that like little oomph in my step again. I was like, that's incredible. That's a really powerful recipe, you know?
Yeah, that's way different than a cannabis brownie recipe, which, may impact you in many ways. But yeah, for me, for that class of people, they were regaining relationships with their partners that had been strained for like a long time. And like you said, just feeling like more powerful, more sexy, more like I got that. Just walking around with that energy is a totally different way of life. So, yeah, weed lube changing the world.
I think from a cannabis educator perspective, it's a little frustrating that I get all these messages from people like, this is life changing. I've had this life changing experience. Our students have had this life changing experience. and you can't find it anywhere and nobody talks about it. And it's very easy to make. Do you have it in Canada? Can you buy it?
I'm in Ontario, and we have a really big product line in Ontario as opposed to like the rest of Canada. And we have one product here that we can buy that's a water-based lubricant. It's mostly CBD. There's hardly any THC in it again, though. So for people who are looking for that, at least here in Ontario, we don't have easy access to it. And the thing that I want people to know when they're thinking about making weed lube is that this doesn't have to be like a big investment. You can try this with a nug of cannabis, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can do it in very small batches and would suggest you using very small batches until you know it works for you. I just really want I want everyone to start to run off to their kitchen as soon as this ends and make one of the 3 varieties of weed lube that we are going to give to you.
Yeah. Can you tell me about them? Because you have your original weed lube recipe on, but you're making something super cool right now. So can we talk about it?
Yeah. So the original, the first one was a very thick weed lube, right? It was stored in the fridge. Usually you could kind of make a suppository out of it. It was definitely a lot more tactile. And then when Foria came out, I was like, oh, I want to be able to put it in a spray bottle. This works better. So then I made a second weed lube recipe that's much like that one. Love that. Between those two, people were finding something that worked for them. But when I started looking at this again, I was like, yeah, there was nothing that was condom friendly, and there was nothing that was condom friendly plus natural. Like you can take a lot of, just store bought stuff and infuse cannabis into it. But I didn't want to take store bought stuff and infuse cannabis into it because every time I look at a label of most of the store bought lubes, I was like, ugh, no, thank you. So I started looking into it. I'm working on developing a recipe. It will be ready by the time this podcast comes out for listeners. So I would love for you all to test it. It's going to be aloe based and natural and awesome. It already made my hand awesome. So one of the things as I was developing this one, I was like, I want something that's condom safe. I also wanted to know if there was something that could increase the availability in those tissues. And so I'm experimenting with a couple of things. And one of those things is hyaluronic acid. And I know that when you say that and when I read it, I was like, you're going to put acid in your what? But the more I looked into it, it's being used in a variety of ways for lubricants, especially for people who are perimenopausal and menopausal, to naturally increase lubrication in those tissues. It's something your body already makes. And so I'm experimenting with that as well and incorporating that in. And when I did my little hand test right before we came on today, it was like I rubbed it on. I was like, oh yay, this is like smooth and silky and this is great. This is going to be a great texture for that. And then almost instantly it was like into my skin, leaving soft skin. And so, yeah, I am interested as we continue to develop this, how that works out. So go ahead and try the new recipe.
Yeah. Find it at wakeandbake.com.
Yep. We'll leave the links for everything below. Again, I have the 2 other versions as well, the Old Faithfuls of weed lube that have been tested by hundreds and hundreds of people. And like Andrea said, can be made with as little as a nug. So worth trying out even with a small amount of cannabis. So there are a total of 3 weed lube recipes for you to choose from. And those will be below.
You're like the weed lube lady now. Eh? You've got 3 weed lube recipes on your website. You don't have 3 of any other website or any other recipes, do you?
Maybe brownies.
Okay. Okay, so if you're listening to this and you go try this, then you need to get a stopwatch, have some orgasms, and then write to us and tell us how long they lasted. We need to know, right?
We obviously need to know. Everyone listening needs to get a bottle of weed lube and a smart vibrator so we can compile this data because nobody's going to do it for us. We need to become citizen scientists. Carl Sagan would be proud. He's cheering us from the beyond. Yay! Now, if this podcast was helpful to you, please share it. And if you want to create helpful content like it, don't forget to register for that free webinar today. We will see you there. Hello, welcome to the Wake and Bake podcast.
Where we dance and sing.
Where we try to get an episode done once every few months. I don't care if you like the podcast. I hope you hate the podcast if it means that you're like, oh, I hate these ladies tell me to do stuff that I know is good for me. A couple of hoo-has over there. I meant yahoos, but I've been thinking so much about this.
I've had like
Oh,
really long orgasms before. I don't think it's been 9 minutes, but
like how long?
oh,
Can we-
like
no, save
minutes
it.
and minutes long.
Save it. Wow.
Yeah. You do not want to check your phone. It is not
Like
on the
minutes and minutes
agenda.
long. I think I'm so funny.
I also
Don't
think you're
forget that,
hilarious.
like, I was like, as I was writing this, I put Andrea laughs at my joke. I'm gonna
try
force
to
you to
straight
laugh at
face
this
it.
bit.
No, I'm gonna be
No.
like, wow, Corinne, that wasn't amusing at all. Try harder.
It's actually not that good. That's why I think it's so funny that my joke, the one that I'm like, Andrea, just laugh at my joke, it's not very good. So
But somebody needs to laugh at it, damn it.
we're hosting a free webinar for people who are interested in doing this kind of work in the world. If you want to talk about boners and
If you want
weed,
to talk about boners.
our bloopers are going to be longer than the entire fucking
It's true.
episode at this point.
It's true.
Weed lube, weed lube, weed lube.
Weed lube,
Oh,
9 minute
no.
orgasm, weed
That's
lube, 9
recorded.
minute orgasm.
9-minute orgasm is hard. I had a 9-minute orgasm on weed lube. I don't know. I don't orgasm on weed lube. That's going in our DJ mix. Orgasm, orgasm.
If this doesn't work out, we can go into that instead.
And she was like, my stopwatch is in my hoo-ha.
That's where I keep
timed
it.
What if I put it on my vajayjay and my vajayjay falls off? Then we'll just cut this part.
Yeah.
Are we only recording a bloopers reel right now? Because it feels
Apparently.
like we're nailing it if
Yep.
that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
I love how we're like, we can't just sit and laugh for an hour. And I'm like, that's exactly what I'm going to spend my podcast
I'm going to write
credit
stuff
doing.
in there so that we can't do anything but.
Oh, we can do butt stuff. That's because it must have blasted his rocket ship out of orbit. That doesn't even make sense.
No, you can't even get it out.
I'm not going to talk about Carl Sagan's penis like a rocket ship. That feels wrong.
I actually want to know a lot about this now.
I mean, what do you want to know?
I want to know about Carl Sagan's rocket ship penis. Rocket ship penis.
We lube, we lube, we lube. We lube. We lube.
I am part of you now.
We lube, we lube, we lube.
Carl Sagan's rocket ship penis.
Orgasm. Oh, my leg smells like weed now.
Carl Sagan's rocket ship penis.
Like how long? Orgasm.
The 9-minute one? Like, bring it on. Maybe we can try for 10.
Wow.
I'm down. This is what I'm here for.